the least, now brazenly criticizing the West for its action. I'll get to you in a moment. Let's go to Theresa May. She's walking to the podium now. Here's her reaction.
Last night, British, French and American armed forces conducted coordinated and targeted strikes to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deter their use. For the UK's part, 4 RAF Tornado GR4s launched Storm Shadow missiles at a military facility some 15 miles west of Homs, where the regime is assessed to keep chemical weapons in breach of Syria's obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. While the full assessment of the strike is ongoing, we are confident of its success. Let me set out why we have taken this action. Last Saturday, up to 75 people, including young children, were killed in a despicable and barbaric attack in Douma, with as many as 500 further casualties. We have worked with our allies to establish what happened, and all the indications are that this was a chemical weapons attack. We have seen the harrowing images of men, women and children lying dead with foam in their mouths. These were innocent families who, at the time this chemical weapon was unleashed, were seeking shelter underground in basements. First-hand accounts from NGOs and aid workers have detailed the most horrific suffering, including burns to the eyes, suffocation and skin discoloration, with a chlorine-like odour surrounding the victims. And the World Health Organization has received reports that hundreds of patients arrived at Syrian health facilities on Saturday night with signs and symptoms consistent with exposure to toxic chemicals. We are also clear about who was responsible for this atrocity. A significant body of information, including intelligence, indicates the Syrian regime is responsible for this latest attack. I cannot tell you everything, but let me give an example of some of the evidence that leads us to this conclusion. Open source accounts allege that a barrel bomb was used to deliver the chemicals. Multiple open source reports claim that a regime helicopter was observed above the city of Douma on the evening of the 7th of April. The opposition does not operate helicopters or use barrel bombs. And reliable intelligence indicates that Syrian military officials coordinated what appears to be the use of chlorine in Douma on the 7th of April. No other group could have carried out this attack. Indeed, Daesh, for example, does not even have a presence in Douma. And the fact of this attack should surprise no one. We know that the Syrian regime has an utterly abhorrent record of using chemical weapons against its own people. On the 21st of August 2013, over 800 people were killed and thousands more injured in a chemical attack also in Ghouta. There were 14 further smaller-scale chemicals attacks prior to that summer. At Khan Sheikhoun on the 4th of April last year, the Syrian regime used sarin against its people, killing around 100 with a further 500 casualties. And based on the regime's persistent pattern of behaviour and the cumulative analysis of specific incidents, we judge it highly likely both that the Syrian regime has continued to use chemical weapons since then and will continue to do so. This must be stopped. We have sought to do so using every possible diplomatic channel, but our efforts have been repeatedly thwarted, both on the ground and in the United Nations. Following the sarin attack in eastern Damascus back in August 2013, the Syrian regime committed to dismantle its chemical weapon programme, and Russia promised to ensure that Syria did this, overseen by the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But these commitments have not been met. A recent report from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has said that Syria's declaration of its former chemical weapons programme is incomplete. This indicates that it continues to retain undeclared stocks of nerve agent or precursor chemicals and is likely to be continuing with some chemical weapons production. The OPCW inspectors have investigated previous attacks and on 4 occasions decided that the regime was indeed responsible. And on each occasion, when we have seen every sign of chemical weapons being used, any attempt to hold the perpetrators to account has been blocked by Russia at the UN Security Council, with 6 such vetoes since the start of 2017. Just this week, the Russians vetoed a draft resolution that would have established an independent investigation into this latest attack, even making the grotesque and absurd claim that it was staged by Britain. So we have no choice but to conclude that diplomatic action on its own will not be any more effective in the future than it has been in the past. Over the last week, the UK government has been working intensively with our international partners to build the evidence picture and to consider what action we need to take to prevent and deter future humanitarian catastrophes caused by chemical weapons attacks. When the Cabinet met on Thursday, we considered the advice of the Attorney General, the National Security Advisor, and the Chief of the Defence Staff, and we were updated on the latest assessment and intelligence picture. And based on this advice, we agreed that it was both right and legal to take military action, together with our closest allies, to alleviate further humanitarian suffering by degrading the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deterring their use. This was not about interfering in a civil war, and it was not about regime change. As I discussed with President Trump and President Macron, it was a limited, targeted and effective strike with clear boundaries that expressly sought to avoid escalation and did everything possible to prevent civilian casualties. Together, we have hit a specific and limited set of targets. They were a chemical weapons storage and production facility, a key chemical weapons research centre, and a military bunker involved in chemical weapons attacks. Hitting these targets with the force that we have deployed will significantly degrade the Syrian regime's ability to research, develop and deploy chemical weapons. A year ago, after the atrocity at Khan Sheikhoun, the US conducted a strike on the airfield from which the attack took place. But Assad and his regime hasn't stopped their use of chemical weapons. So last night's strikes by the US, UK and France were significantly larger than the US action a year ago and specifically designed to have a greater impact on the regime's capability and willingness to use chemical weapons. And this collective action sends a clear message that the international community will not stand by and tolerate the use of chemical weapons. I also want to be clear that this military action to deter the use of chemical weapons does not stand alone. We must remain committed to resolving the conflict at large. The best hope for the Syrian people remains a political solution. We need all partners, especially the regime and its backers, to enable humanitarian access to those in desperate need, and the UK will continue to strive for both. But these strikes are about deterring the barbaric use of chemical weapons in Syria and beyond. And so to achieve this, there must also be a wider diplomatic effort, including the full range of political and economic levers, to strengthen the global norms prohibiting the use of chemical weapons, which have stood for nearly a century. Although of a much lower order of magnitude, the use of a nerve agent on the streets of the UK in recent weeks is part of a pattern of disregard for these norms. So while this action is specifically about deterring the Syrian regime, it will also send a clear signal to anyone else who believes they can use chemical weapons with impunity. There is no graver decision for a Prime Minister than to commit our forces to combat. And this is the first time that I have had to do so. As always, they have served our country with the greatest professionalism and bravery, and we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. We would have preferred an alternative path, but on this occasion there is none. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised, either within Syria, on the streets of the UK or elsewhere. We must reinstate the global consensus that chemical weapons cannot be used. This action is absolutely in Britain's national interest. The lesson of history is that when the global rules and standards that keep us safe come under threat, we must take a stand and defend them. That is what our country has always done, and that is what we will continue to do. I'll take a number of questions. Let me start with Laura.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News. Your logic is that chemical attacks must not go unpunished. Will you do the same again if President Assad does the same again, as you have suggested he has? And do you feel you have the public's consent, given that you have not even consulted MPs in Parliament?
As I said in my statement, the purpose of the action that took place last night was to degrade and deter the capability and willingness of the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons. As I also said, obviously a full assessment has not yet been completed, but we believe that the action was successful. But the Syrian regime should be under no doubt of our resolve in relation to this matter of the use of chemical weapons. And I have taken this decision because I believe it is the right thing to do. I believe it is in our national interest, but I believe it is also important for the international community to be very clear about this issue, that we have seen people appearing to think that they can use chemical weapons with impunity. And we must restore the position of that, as I said, has existed for nearly a century, that the use of chemical weapons is illegal, it is banned, and we cannot accept it. Tim?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Tim Shipman from the Sunday Times. You were hinting towards the end of your statement there about possible further wider action against supporters of the regime. Can you explain why you haven't yet taken action against Russian money in London in the same way that the United States has? And on a linked point, we appear to be in a propaganda war with the Russians. Why have no ministers been out explaining what you've been explaining today throughout a week in which the Russian ambassador has been accusing Britain of culpability for the crimes that you've addressed this evening?
Well, on the first point, as you will know, Tim, and as I said in response to the use of the nerve agent on the streets of Salisbury, we are, of course, looking at every aspect of the action that can be taken. We do, in general, work against illicit finances, against criminal finances here in the UK, and we will continue to do so. You say that no minister has been out over the past week. I've given 2 television interviews over the past week in which I've set out the need for action and the need for us to restore the international norm of the recognition that chemical weapons should not be used. What I said in those interviews was that we were working with our international partners and allies to ascertain, make the fullest possible assessment of what happened on the ground, and then to ascertain what action was necessary. We've done that, and the action that we saw last night into the early hours of this morning was the result of that work. Adam.
Prime Minister, I wonder if you could explain a little more your decision and your thinking on not seeking prior approval or debate from Parliament on this decision, because, as you know, Jeremy Corbyn and on the other side Kenneth Clarke have both said that they feel that that should have taken place, and there seems to be a feeling abroad that Tony Blair set a precedent back in 2003.
Well, as I said, as I've just said, I believe that this action was necessary. I believe it was the right thing for us to do. We have been working with our allies and partners over the past week, first to make the fullest possible assessment of what happened on the ground, and then to consider what action was necessary, and to do that in a timely fashion so that we could act with sufficient understanding of what had happened on the ground and proper planning of any action, but to do so within a timescale that gave a very clear message to the regime. And it was also important, and I believe it is important, as we are sending, it is one of the gravest decision that a Prime Minister can take is to send our service personnel into action, into combat. And when we do that, we owe it to them that we, as far as possible, protect their safety and their security. And for operational security reasons, it was right that we've acted in the way that we did. Properly plan this, assess what happened on the ground, properly plan it, act within a timescale that's right to both protect operational security and give a very clear message to the regime. Robert?
You explicitly linked the overnight action to the poisonings in Salisbury. Was the overnight action just about Assad, or was it explicitly a warning to Russia as well? The Secretary-General is warning that the Cold War is back, and he is fearful we don't have the institutional structures to contain it. How do we restore a sense of calm and security?
Well, first of all, I referred to what happened in Salisbury, because it was the use of a chemical weapon, a nerve agent, on the streets of the United Kingdom. The action that took place last night was an action which was focused on degrading and deterring the operational capability and the willingness of the Syrian regime to continue to use chemical weapons. As I said, there have been many instances when we have seen them using those chemical weapons. But I believe it should also be a message to others that the international community is not going to stand by and allow chemical weapons to be used with impunity. We have, for nearly a century now, had a general understanding under the Chemical Weapons Convention that chemical weapons were illegal, that their use was banned. We have in recent times all too often seen chemical weapons being used. I think it's right that the international community has come together and said that we will not accept this, and given a very clear message about that we want to re-establish that international norm that chemical weapons are banned and should not be used. Yes.
Bénédicte Pavio, France 24. If chemical weapons are indeed used again in Syria, will the United Kingdom take part in more targeted strikes? And since, if it's in the coming weeks, Parliament will no longer be in recess, will you feel a bigger pressure to actually ask for that green light? And how important is it to you that President Macron is alongside and very much participating in this operation? How would you characterize the Franco-British entente about this operation?
Well, first of all, on the parliamentary front, and I apologise, I should have made reference to this in answer to the previous questions. I will be in Parliament on Monday to make a statement to Parliament and obviously to give parliamentarians the opportunity to question me about this. I believe it was right to take the action that we have done in the timing that we have done, as I've indicated, in relation to assessment, planning and operational security. And it was to send a very clear message about the use of these chemical weapons. I believe that the action that's taken will have significantly degraded the capability of the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons. We want to deter their willingness to use chemical weapons as well, but they should be in no doubt of our resolve, and I believe that is an international resolve on these issues, to ensure that we do return to the situation where it is accepted that the use of chemical weapons is illegal, is banned, they should not be used. I think, obviously, this has been a tripartite operation with the United States, with France and the United Kingdom. You asked specifically about the Franco-British relationship. I think we have a very good and close relationship on security and defence matters. That was enhanced in the summit the Franco-British summit we had earlier this year. We have been, over recent years, working increasingly closely together on these defence matters.
With respect, Prime Minister, you didn't address the question that, if there are more chemical weapons attacks in Syria in the coming weeks, will you authorise and instruct, indeed, the RAF to carry out more targeted strikes without or with a green light from Parliament?
As I said, in relation to this, I will be going to Parliament and will be making a statement in Parliament. On the wider issue, I did address the wider issue of this. This was a limited and targeted strike that took place last night, or series of strikes that took place last night by the three partners, but nobody should be in any doubt of our resolve on this issue, which is to ensure that we see a return to that international norm on the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons. Sorry, yes, the gentleman.
Thank you. Joe Watts, The Independent. The Syrian civil war has seen a huge displacement of people from the Middle East towards the West. I'm just wondering if you think that your action today and the threat of further action from the West will exacerbate that and cause more people, more refugees to come to the West. And if you can tell us what extra planning, extra actions you're going to be taking to address that point, ease the pressure on nations and help the refugees themselves.
Well, you're right to say that, of course, as a result of what has been taking place in Syria over the last few years, 7 years or so, we have seen a large number of people displaced within Syria and obviously a large number of refugees from Syria being displaced both to countries in the region and further afield. And, of course, we have been receiving a number of Syrian refugees here in the UK ourselves. But our focus has always been on support for refugees in the region, with considerable support to countries that have been providing refuge for them. Obviously, Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey are the three countries that have particularly been providing refuge for them. The purpose of this action is to prevent further humanitarian suffering. I think nobody can have been anything but appalled at the scenes that we saw and we've read about from the attack that took place in Douma, it is right, I believe, that the international community has acted to give that very clear message about this use of chemical weapons.
Hi, Jessica Algott from The Guardian. Prime Minister, are you concerned that you perhaps do not have the support of the British people for this action? Polling has shown that it's around a fifth of people who support further action in Syria. And what's your message to people who are uneasy about the action you've taken?
Well, as I said, I have taken this decision because I believe it is the right thing to do. I think my message to people about this is that this is about the use of chemical weapons. We have, for nearly 100 years now, had a generally accepted position in the international community that, because chemical weapons are illegal, their use is illegal, they're banned, and that has generally been accepted. We have seen that international norm being eroded. It's been eroded in a number of ways. As I say, we've seen a nerve agent used on the streets of a city here in the United Kingdom. But we have seen the Syrian regime continuing to use chemical weapons, despite the fact that after August 2013, they said they were dismantling their chemical weapons, and Russia guaranteed that that was taking place. Though that commitment has not been met. And so I think it is important that for the alleviation of humanitarian suffering in Syria, but also if we stand back and look at this more widely, I think it is in all our interests that we restore that international norm on the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons. Yes.
Glen Owen, Mail on Sunday. How much did you agonise about this decision? Did it keep you awake at night?
As I said in my statement, and I've repeated since, that there is no graver decision that a Prime Minister can take than to send service personnel into combat. And it is a decision that I have not taken lightly. As you know, there have been a number of discussions here with the National Security Council and at Cabinet, together with discussions with our American and French allies on this. But at the end of the day, I felt it was the right thing to do, precisely because we have seen this growing use of chemical weapons. And I think that we must say this must stop. And it is in all our interests for us to ensure that the use of chemical weapons stops. And it's in the interests of all our futures to ensure that the use of chemical weapons stops. Yeah, here on the front row. Sorry, Jay, making you...
Hello, Toby Helm from The Observer. Obviously, there's been no parliamentary approval for this action for reasons of timing, apart from anything else. But when Parliament resumes next week, do you intend to try to get Parliament as a whole to back your strategy, which clearly you are opening the door to possible further action from what you say? Do you intend to push for a vote to get Parliament behind you?
Well, as I say, and as you've picked up, in fact, in your question, I think it was right to take, the decision was taken for operational reasons after we'd had the opportunity to provide the fullest possible assessment and proper planning, and I believe it was the right thing to do. But we will, of course, be giving an opportunity. As I say, I'll be the first opportunity when Parliament resits will be on Monday for me to go into Parliament to make a statement and to hear the views of parliamentarians on this issue. And I will be very clear with Parliament, as I have been clear this morning and have been clear with others, that this is not about action to intervene in the civil war. It is not about anything to do with regime change. It is about the use of chemical weapons. It's a limited and targeted set of strikes that have taken place in order to degrade and deter the capability to use chemical weapons. Sorry, on the second row here.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Rahim Al-Farsi from Sky News Arabia. During your many statements, you have repeatedly talked about the victims of the Duma incident. Have you considered, or are you considering, to have some of these victims have the care and the medical care as the same was given to these cripples here in this country or in the West? And secondly, if it emerges that the Syrian regime has got other chemical sites that have not been attacked, would you go after them, and would you enlarge your tripartite coalition?
Well, first of all, on the first point, obviously one of the issues that we have as the United Kingdom, together with other international parties, had concern for is the ability to access and provide the support necessary to victims, those who have been suffering from the humanitarian catastrophe that has been the use of chemical weapons, but indeed more generally in Syria. And as you will also know, we've made a number of attempts through the United Nations and others in other ways to try to ensure proper humanitarian access to people, to ensure that they can be provided with the proper medical care. And we will continue to push for that humanitarian access so that those who are innocent victims can be provided with the support that they need. As I've said in response to other questions, I believe it's important. This was a collective action taken by the UK together with France and the United States. There have been a number of other supportive statements from other international leaders that have come out following the action. The intent of the international community now must be to make every effort through a variety of channels to ensure that we can give this very clear message about the use of chemical weapons. That is what this action has been about, and that is what we will continue to press on in a whole variety of ways. Just behind you, Jay.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Japan's newspaper, Yomiuri Shimbun. Because of this continuing and heightening tension between the West and Russia, some people started to call this situation a new Cold War. And what would you do, or could you do, in order not to let this military activity lead to a new Cold War?
Well, as I say, this action has been focused on the activities of the Syrian regime. Obviously, the Syrian regime has been backed by Russia. Action has been about chemical weapons. There is also the wider issue of restoring peace and stability and security in Syria, a political situation to that. And we will continue to work with all partners. And, of course, Russia's involvement in that will be a part of that, to bring about that security and that peace for Syria for the future, and a political solution for Syria for the future. Just alongside.
Simon Israel from Channel 4 News. Given the failure, as you have said in your statement, of all diplomatic efforts so far, what is the plan following these strikes?
Sorry, what is the plan for?
What is the plan, your plan, following these strikes?
Following the strike. Yes, well, as I've said, diplomatic efforts in itself has not had the impact that we wished it would have. We've now taken the military action, and alongside that, we will renew diplomatic efforts as well. And some of those obviously will continue to be through the United Nations to press for proper investigatory capability, opportunities for proper investigation and the holding to account of those who use these chemical weapons. As I said, the aim of this is to degrade operational capability of the Syrian regime and to deter their willingness to use chemical weapons. But there is the wider issue of overall the message for the international community about the use of chemical weapons, and we will continue to pursue that through the United Nations and through other fora. Alongside. Yeah.
Thank you. Ed Malnick from The Telegraph. Were there any communications with the Russian government or military about possible military action before it was taken?
This is not something that the United Kingdom has been involved in. As you'll be aware, this is a complicated picture in terms of operations that take place in Syria. Full and proper planning was put in place before these strikes were undertaken to ensure that we could mitigate and minimise the impact on civilians and ensure that these strikes were absolutely targeted at their aim, which was the chemical weapons capability of the Syrian regime.
Thank you. Nina from the Press Association. What would you say to Britons and indeed others who may now fear reprisals in the wake of the attacks?
We have, of course, taken steps to ensure that we are providing support and have looked at those Britons who are overseas who may be concerned about such attacks. And the Foreign Office, of course, is providing advice to people as it would do in these circumstances. That's here.
Katrin Kalweit, Süddeutsche Zeitung. Prime Minister, OPCW was on the way of going into Duma today. Why not wait 1 or 2 days in order to get a formal proof for the reproaches that there have been used chemical weapons, especially since the Russians are at the moment very carefully framing information that there are no proofs and that Great Britain is lying?
Well, first of all, we have made every effort over the past week to assess what has happened on the ground. We have, as I've indicated in my statement, I've given a number of examples of the factors that were present that have led us to believe not just that this was a chemical weapons attack, but that it was a weapons attack at the hands of the Syrian regime. And this is not the only attack that has taken place, and the reason for our action isn't simply about what happened in Duma, it's about a wider pattern of the use of chemical weapons. The OPCW has on 4 previous occasions investigated and identified the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons, and I think it was important that at the point at which we had the information that showed us that all the indications were that this was a chemical weapons attack at the hands of the Syrian regime, the planning had been put in place, that we took the action that was necessary. Right, over there.
Thank you. Elodie Goulesque, CNews French TV. Given that chemical attacks happened before in Syria and the UK didn't take such measures as yesterday, do you think your decision last night about Syria would have been the same if the Salisbury attack didn't happen?
We looked at this very much in terms of what had happened in Syria and the continued use of chemical weapons in Syria. After Khan Sheikhoun, the United States chose to act alone in relation to those attacks. I believe it was right on this occasion that there was a wider collective action that took place, which showed the strength of the action that was being taken. It was significantly greater action than was taken after Khan Sheikhoun, but also showed that strength of that international community's response. We've been concerned for some time about the use of chemical weapons in Syria, and the evidence that has been gathered about that continued use of chemical weapons was such that we felt it was right to participate on this occasion. We've just got 3 more here, so at the back there.
Nigel Nelson, Sunday Mirror, Sunday People. I'm still a little unclear about what you see the role of Parliament in this. In the event that the UK takes further military action, will you put that to a vote of MPs?
Well, first of all, as I said, this decision was taken because I believe it was the right thing to do. The power to take this decision is obviously a prerogative power, and at the first opportunity for Parliament will have an opportunity to question this, and I will be in Parliament, as I've said, on Monday in order to do so. The intent of this action is that it does degrade and it does deter the Syrian regime from taking action. We will be following up with further diplomatic efforts in relation to this wider question of the use of chemical weapons. Two more. One.
Camilla Tominey, Sunday Express. In light of Russia continuing to use its veto, are you concerned about the ongoing effectiveness of the United Nations?
Well, I think my message would be this about the Security Council. Membership of the Security Council is, permanent membership of the Security Council is given only to a limited number of countries. I think it is important that those who sit around that Security Council table take seriously the responsibility they have to the wider international community for decisions that are taken. I hope that the action that is being taken in Syria will deter and degrade the Syrian regime's capability and willingness to use chemical weapons, but will also send a message to others about the use of chemical weapons. This is illegal, it's banned, it should not happen. And the gentleman on the second row here.
William James, Reuters. Prime Minister, you've been very clear that this was not about regime change. Why not? And is it the British position now that Assad can stay as long as he doesn't use chemical weapons?
No, this was about, as I've said, and you've recognised, this was specifically about the use of chemical weapons. There is a wider question on the future political solution for Syria, and that is a matter that we will continue to pursue in diplomatic channels and diplomatic and political channels with our international partners and allies. Now, the last one I'll take is from Dave.
David Woodingson on Sunday. I'm just wondering, in light of the benefit of hindsight, do you feel that this, what's happened over the last 5 years has demonstrated that the vote in 2013 to take no action proves that taking no action in these cases can be as devastating as going in?
Well, obviously, as you'll be aware, I was a member of the government in 2013. I voted to take action in 2013. I believe when the government put that to Parliament, we did it because we felt at the time it was the right thing to do. Following that, of course, there were commitments given by the Syrian regime in relation to destroying their chemical weapons, and Russia committed to guaranteeing that that was taking place. That has not happened. And I think it is right now that we have sent that clear message by taking this military action. Thank you.
All right there for nearly 40 minutes there, the British Prime Minister Theresa May addressing the press and the British people, saying that she couldn't give all of the evidence, but did basically explain the evidence that she could as to why that nation took the action that it did, and also explaining why diplomacy fell short.
She certainly made clear her resolve on this issue of chemical weapons and that that was the purpose behind this strike, and saying also that there was, she felt, no other alternative.
Let's bring in our senior international correspondent, Noel Burger, following the story live in London. Nima, I know you were listening on there at number 10. What were the main takeaways from what you heard?
Well, for me, this was the first time that we got details of the facilities that were struck. That was obviously very key. A storage and production facility, a research facility, and a military bunker involved in chemical attacks. She also specified where the RAF, where the Royal Air Force had hit, which was just west of Homs. But she also put out the stall in terms of rebutting a lot of what we've been hearing from the Russians, that this was illegal, that this was unjustified. She makes very clear that Russia was in contravention of the international chemical weapons watchdog's requirements in terms of doing away with their chemical weapons stockpile, but also that Russia guaranteed that this would be done. So she was carefully putting together an argument in terms of the broader Russian culpability. And it was towards the end that really she put out her stall in terms of how much this is in Britain's national interest. The sense really is emerging here, George, that Britain, out of the three allies, has the clearest argument in terms of broader national interest. She reminded those of us who are listening in that Britain has itself seen an act of Russian aggression, and this is what the British government believe, on its own soil with the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, the Russian double agent, and his daughter, and this was a use of chemical weapons with impunity, an act that Britain believes to be an act of Russian aggression. And so this was in part a response to that. And she spoke about the fact that impunity in the use of chemical weapons cannot go without a response. But also she left the door open for future attacks, and that has been a point of contention between the Pentagon and President Trump. President Trump also left the door open for further attacks when he spoke in the aftermath of these attacks, but then General Mattis stepped forward and said, you know, these were limited, this was the only case that we are dealing with right now. But Prime Minister Theresa May there saying, George, that if we need to, we will strike again.
Now, it was also interesting to hear her address the Russian claim that this might have been somehow staged by the United Kingdom, basically describing that as an absurd allegation. So these actions taken overnight, you heard the Prime Minister bring up the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and Yulia Skripal. The question here, she says these actions were taken on the issue of chemical weapons, but is this also seen there in the United Kingdom as a warning to Russia?
Absolutely, and it's interesting that in the hours before this attack, yesterday, the National Security Advisor here, Sir Mark Sedwill, took a pretty unprecedented step of making public classified information, the evidence around the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter, and why Britain believes that it was Russia. And they talked the British public through all of these very key points, what kind of an agent it was, the level of purity, and why they believe not only that this couldn't have been a non-state actor, but they also have evidence that the Russian intelligence services had actually been tracking Sergei and Yulia Skripal for the last 5 years. They also have evidence, they say, that Russians had actually been acting out. They'd been gaming out circumstances in which Novichok, the nerve agent used in this poisoning, could be used on door handles, which was exactly the way in which the poison was used in the Sergei Skripal and Yulia Skripal attack. The sense here is that before she goes ahead of Parliament on Monday, she wanted to make very clear to the British public that out of the three allies, Britain needed this to happen. That Britain and Europe as a whole, because of course Macron, the French leader, is on board with this as well, see what happened in Syria, what happened on the streets of Salisbury here in the UK as part of a continuum of Russian overreach that stretches all the way back to 2014 and their annexation of the Crimean territory in the Ukraine, and that the world now cannot stand idly by in the face of Russia's actions, George.
Our senior international correspondent, Noel Burger, live outside number 10. Thank you for the reporting, and we'll stay in touch with you. Let's also now put this into focus.